Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Bacon. Welcome to the show, y'all. Coming out of the hole after a month in the dark is like being born again into a world that wants you dead. Leo walked back onto the tier, the wound on his hand a dull, throbbing reminder of his own and final and desperate choice. He had failed Silas. He was a dead man. He just waited. He waited for the justice of the yard to find him. But the yard is a strange and unpredictable beast. And the story of what had happened, the story of the fish who had been sent to kill a king and who had in the end turned the blade on himself, it had spread through the prison like a wildfire. It was a story that went against the grain of this world. A story of a different kind of a strength, a quiet and profound and in its own and strange and beautiful way, honorable kind of a strength. Joseph, the old head who had been the target, he was a man of a quiet and absolute power. He had seen it all, and he saw in Leo's act of a self-destruction not a weakness, but a courage to refuse to become a monster. And he made a decision. He was going to protect the boy. He sent a message to Silas, a quiet and simple and absolute message. The boy is mine now, it said. You touch him, and you will have a war that you cannot win. It was a checkmate. And Silas, a man who understood the brutal and unforgiving calculus of a power, knew it. He had lost his pawn, and he had, in the end, lost the game. Leo came out of the hole a different man. He was no longer a ghost, a victim. He was a man who had a new and powerful and unexpected protector. He was Joseph's man now, and in the brutal and tribal world of the prison, that made him a prince. The other inmates looked at him with a new and quiet and grudging respect. He was the kid who had stood up to Silas and who had, by some miracle, survived. He had walked into that hallway a sheep on his way to the slaughter, and he had come out a lion, or at least a cub, under the protection of the king of the jungle. He had been a boy who had been willing to sell his soul for a handful of a commissary, but he had in the end chosen a different path, and that path, as brutal and as bloody as it had been, had led him to a strange and unexpected and profoundly unlikely kind of a salvation. Life under Joseph's protection was a different kind of a life. It was a life of a quiet and steady and profound education. Joseph was more than just a shot caller. He was a teacher, a philosopher of the yard. He had spent 40 years in a cage, and he had used that time to turn his own and personal hell into a kind of a university. He took Leo under his wing. He taught him the rules of the game, not the rules of a violence and of a brute force, but the rules of a power, of a strategy, of a quiet and patient and absolute self-control. He taught him how to play chess, not just on the board, but in the world. This place is a chessboard, kid, he'd say, his voice a low and gravelly rumble. Every man is a piece, and you have to know what piece you are, and what piece the man across from you is. You were a pawn. Silas tried to sacrifice you, but you refused to be taken. And in that, you became a different kind of a piece that can change the whole game. Leo was a quick study. He soaked up the old man's wisdom like a dry sponge. He learned to be quiet, to be watchful, to listen. He learned that real power is not in the noise you make, but in the silence you keep. He learned that a man's greatest weapon is not a razor blade, but his own and disciplined mind. He became Joseph's right-hand man, his apprentice. He handled his business on the block, the quiet and intricate and profitable business of a man who ruled not with a fear, but with a respect. And in that, he found a new and profound and unexpected kind of a purpose. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a builder. He was a part of something, a family, a different and more honest and more honorable kind of a family than the one he had been born into. And Silas watched from a distance. He saw the boy he had tried to break, the boy he had tried to turn into a monster, become a man who was a reflection of his own and greatest and most profound failure. And the quiet and bitter and impotent rage of a defeated king was a slow and corrosive and permanent poison in his own and lonely soul. The years passed. Leo became a man in that cage. He was no longer the scared kid who had come in on a B&E charge. He was a quiet and thoughtful and respected leader in his own right. He was Joseph's heir apparent, the future of a quiet and powerful and honorable kingdom. He got his GED. He started taking college courses. He was a man who was building a future, even in a world that had no future. He wrote to his girl on the outside, the one he had been so desperate to get stamps for. He didn't make excuses. He didn't make promises. He just told her his story. The story of the man he had been and of the man he was trying to be. And she, in her own and quiet and beautiful way, understood. And she waited. And Silas grew old and bitter and irrelevant. His empire had crumbled, his power faded. He was just another old man haunted by the ghost of his own and brutal and ultimately, in its own and tragic and beautiful way, failed ambition. He and Leo would pass each other in the yard sometimes, and they would just nod. A quiet and mutual and profound acknowledgement of a war that was long over. A war that had, in the end, created a king and destroyed another. In this story, the story of the razor blades and the commissary, it's a story about the brutal and unforgiving nature of a debt, and about the different and often bloody ways that those debts are paid. But it is also a story about a different and more powerful kind of a currency, the currency of a quiet and profound and unbreakable human dignity. Leo had been a boy who had been willing to sell his soul for a handful of a commissary. But in the end, he had chosen a different path. He had chosen to bleed rather than to kill. He had chosen to be a man rather than a monster. And in that choice, he had found his own and quiet and hard-won and ultimately, in its own and strange and beautiful way, victorious kind of a salvation. The final chapter of this story is a quiet one. It is a story of two old men, a teacher and a student, a king and a prince, sitting on a bench in the prison yard, playing a game of chess. Joseph and Leo, a father and a son in a way, bound not by a blood, but by a shared and profound and unbreakable code of a quiet and hard-won and beautiful honor. Leo was granted parole after 4 years. He walked out of those gates a different man. He was no longer a boy, lost in the storm. He was a man who had found his own and quiet and steady and true north. His girl was there waiting for him. And they built a new life, a quiet life, a life that was a million miles away from the cage he had left behind. But he never forgot the man who had saved him. He wrote to Joseph every week. He was his son, his brother, his friend, and he was a testament to the old man's own and quiet and profound legacy, a legacy that was not written in a blood, but in a wisdom. And it's a reminder that even in the darkest and most hopeless of places, it is possible to find a light, a teacher, a father, a friend, a reason to be a better man, a reason to choose a different path, a path of an honor, of a dignity, of a quiet and profound and unbreakable strength. And so we come to the end of the line. The story of a debt and of a blade and of a choice. A story that shows you that the most dangerous prison is not the one with steel bars. It is the one we build for ourselves out of a fear and a desperation and a quiet and profound and all-consuming hunger for a dignity. Leo had been a prisoner of that cage, but he had found a way out. Not by fighting, not by killing, but by a quiet and courageous and profound act of a self-destruction. An act that was, in the end, an act of a self-creation. He had become a man, a good man, in a place that is designed to create monsters. And that is a kind of a miracle. And his story is a testament to the idea that a man is not defined by his worst mistake. He is defined by what he does after, the amends he makes, the healing he seeks, the man he becomes. Leo had been a thief, a junkie, a coward, but in the end he was a king, a quiet king, a gentle king, the king of his own and quiet and hard-won and beautiful soul. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I say peace, y'all.